December 17, 1945, 3:40 in the afternoon. Camp Detention Facility Number 7, somewhere in the frozen hills of occupied Bavaria. The sound of military boots crushing fresh snow creates the only rhythm in a world gone silent. Chaplain Samuel Washington pulls his woolen coat tighter as he approaches the wire, knowing that what he's about to attempt has never been tried before and might never be forgiven. Behind the barbed wire, 37 German women huddled in gray prison uniforms, their breath creating small clouds in the bitter cold. These are not ordinary prisoners of war. These are women who served the Reich, who believed in its mission, who were trained to see men like Chaplain Washington as subhuman enemies deserving only contempt. Military protocol is clear: minimal interaction, basic necessities, no fraternization. But Samuel Washington is about to break that protocol in the most unexpected way possible. He stops 10 feet from the fence, removes a small, worn Bible from his coat pocket, and begins to speak. Not in English, not in the broken German phrases military orientation taught him, but in fluent, perfect German. The language of their childhood prayers, their mother's lullabies, their deepest fears. And in that moment, everything changes. In war, hatred is systematic. It's organized, distributed, reinforced through training and repetition until it becomes as natural as breathing. Enemy soldiers learn to dehumanize each other through carefully constructed narratives that make killing psychologically possible. But sometimes, one voice breaks the system. Sometimes humanity speaks louder than institutional hatred, and what emerges challenges everything we think we know about redemption, forgiveness, and the power of unexpected grace. This is the story of how a black chaplain from rural Alabama taught German prisoners of war that respect transcends the boundaries political systems insist are unbridgeable. How speaking someone's language became speaking to their souls, and how the most radical act of resistance sometimes looks like the simplest gesture of recognition. It's a story about what happens when dignity refuses to respect the artificial categories that war creates, when individual conscience challenges institutional prejudice, when the enemy becomes human through the revolutionary act of being seen, truly seen, as worthy of spiritual care. The winter of 1945 found Europe in ruins, divided between occupying powers learning that victory creates as many problems as it solves. Defeating fascism had not automatically created democracy. Liberating concentration camps had not eliminated racial prejudice. And processing millions of displaced persons required bureaucratic efficiency that often ignored human complexity. In this context, prisoner of war camps operated according to strict protocols designed to maintain order through clear hierarchies, clear boundaries, clear distinctions between liberators and the defeated. German women captured in the final months of the war represented a particular administrative challenge. Many had served in auxiliary roles, communications, medical support, logistical operations that kept the Nazi war machine functioning. Others had been members of organizations like the League of German Girls, trained from adolescence to embrace racial ideology and militaristic nationalism. Military intelligence classified them as potentially dangerous, ideologically committed, requiring careful monitoring and systematic re-education. The camp where Chaplain Washington served housed women between ages 18 and 45, representing a cross-section of German society that had believed in the thousand-year Reich, until Soviet tanks and American bombers made that belief impossible to maintain. They arrived defeated, but not necessarily reformed, hungry but not humble, surviving but not yet ready to accept moral responsibility for the system they had supported. Standard protocol called for minimal interaction between American personnel and German prisoners. Food distribution, medical care, basic administrative procedures, but no extended conversation, no personal relationship, no opportunity for the kind of human connection that might complicate efficient camp management. Chaplains were authorized to provide religious services for American personnel, but not for enemy prisoners who officially had no right to spiritual care from Allied forces. Samuel Washington understood these restrictions, but he also understood something his superior officers did not. During 3 years of military service in segregated units, he had learned that institutional policies often failed to account for human complexity, that following regulations sometimes conflicted with fundamental moral obligations, and that the most important battles were often fought not against external enemies, but against internal systems of dehumanization that military culture sometimes promoted. Born in Tuskegee, Alabama, educated at a seminary that trained black ministers to serve communities excluded from white religious institutions, Chaplain Washington had spent his adult life navigating the gap between Christian ideals and American social practice. He understood what it meant to be considered less than fully human by institutions claiming to represent civilized values, to maintain dignity while accommodating systems designed to deny that dignity, to find ways of honoring individual worth when official policies discouraged such recognition. His German language skills developed during seminary study, where theological education included exposure to German biblical scholarship and Lutheran theological tradition. What began as academic requirement became personal passion. Hours spent reading Dietrich Bonhoeffer's writings about Christian resistance to political evil, studying Karl Barth's theological challenges to Nazi ideology, discovering that German Christianity included voices of conscience that military propaganda never mentioned. By December 1945, Chaplain Washington had been assigned to the camp for 3 months, long enough to observe the daily routines that governed prisoner life, long enough to recognize the human faces behind administrative categories, long enough to understand that these women were processing their own complex relationship with defeat, guilt, survival, and the terrifying task of reconstructing identity when everything they had believed proved false. The idea of conducting religious services in German developed slowly, not as dramatic inspiration, but as gradual recognition of pastoral responsibility that transcended political boundaries. These women had spiritual needs that military regulations ignored, questions about guilt and forgiveness that defeat made urgent, hunger for meaning that prison rations could never satisfy. As a chaplain, Samuel Washington understood that spiritual care was not contingent on nationality, that human souls deserved attention regardless of political affiliation, that pastoral duty sometimes required challenging institutional policies that treated certain people as unworthy of religious consideration. The first attempt happened on a Sunday afternoon in early December. Chaplain Washington approached the prisoner compound during what military personnel called recreational period, a 30-minute break when women could move freely within the barbed wire perimeter, weather permitting. Most huddled in small groups, speaking quietly in German, sharing gossip, complaints about food, speculation about transfer orders, memories of life before the war. When Chaplain Washington began speaking German, the reaction was immediate and confused. Several women stopped their conversations, turned toward the fence with expressions mixing curiosity and suspicion, whispered questions about why this black American soldier was addressing them in their native language. Military protocol had never prepared them for this possibility, that enemy forces might include someone who spoke German fluently, who understood not just their words, but their cultural references, their emotional nuances, their deepest fears about what defeat meant. His first words were simple: "Ich bin hier, mit euch über Hoffnung zu sprechen. I am here to speak with you about hope, not about surrender, not about guilt, not about the political consequences of military defeat, but about hope. The concept seemed almost foreign in a context where survival demanded day-to-day focus, where thinking beyond immediate needs felt like dangerous luxury, where hope had been systematically crushed by months of increasing desperation as the Reich collapsed. The women's response revealed the complexity of their situation. Some turned away immediately, refusing to acknowledge that spiritual conversation with enemy forces was even possible, clinging to ideological training that demanded contempt for American soldiers, especially Black American soldiers whom Nazi propaganda had characterized as racially inferior. Others listened with the cautious interest of people desperate for any form of genuine human connection, any conversation that treated them as individuals rather than administrative problems requiring efficient processing. Brunhilde, a former communications officer from Munich, became the first to engage directly. 24 years old, educated in languages before the war, she had spent 2 years coordinating radio communications between German units before capture during the final retreat from American forces. Her initial question carried both linguistic precision and emotional challenge. Warum sollten wir Ihnen vertrauen? Why should we trust you? The question went far beyond immediate circumstances, beyond individual personality or military affiliation, to the heart of what defeat meant for people trained to believe in German superiority and American moral bankruptcy. Trust required reconsidering fundamental assumptions about race, nationality, military purpose, the meaning of liberation versus occupation. For women who had been taught that Black Americans represented biological inferiority and cultural degeneracy, trusting a Black chaplain meant abandoning core elements of worldview that had organized their understanding of reality. Chaplain Washington's response avoided political argument or moral lecture, instead focusing on shared human experience with suffering, loss, the search for meaning when familiar certainties collapse. He spoke about his own community's experience with systematic marginalization, about maintaining faith when social institutions denied dignity, about finding hope in contexts where hope seemed impossible, not comparing experiences, not claiming equivalent suffering, but acknowledging common humanity that transcended political categories. The breakthrough came when he began reading scripture in German, not translating American Protestant interpretation, but drawing on German theological tradition that these women recognized from childhood religious education. Luther's translation of the 23rd Psalm carried emotional resonance that English version could never achieve. Connected to memories of confirmation classes, family worship, cultural tradition that existed independently of Nazi ideology but had been subordinated to political requirements during the war years. As weeks passed, more women began participating in what became informal religious gatherings. Not official services, since military regulations prohibited organized religious activities for enemy prisoners, but spontaneous conversations about spiritual questions that defeat made urgent. How does God judge nations? Can individuals be forgiven for supporting evil systems? What does redemption mean when survival required moral compromise? These questions had no easy answers, but they created space for dialogue that acknowledged complexity rather than demanding simple confession or blanket condemnation. The transformation didn't happen uniformly. Some women remained resistant, clinging to ideological training as the only stable element in circumstances that had eliminated everything else familiar. Others began questioning assumptions they had never examined, recognizing that their experience with Chaplain Washington contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught them about racial hierarchy and American moral character. Still others found in these conversations the first opportunity, since capture to explore guilt, responsibility, the possibility of rebuilding identity based on recognition of wrong rather than denial of personal involvement. Military authorities noticed the change in camp dynamics. Fewer disciplinary incidents, increased cooperation with administrative procedures, requests for educational materials that hadn't been made previously. But they also noticed that these improvements coincided with unauthorized religious activities that violated regulations about prisoner-staff interaction. Questions arose about whether Chaplain Washington was exceeding his authority, whether his activities compromised camp security, whether allowing spiritual care for enemy prisoners set dangerous precedents for military discipline. The confrontation came in January, when Colonel Matthews summoned Chaplain Washington to explain reports of unauthorized religious services for German prisoners. The colonel's concerns were both practical and philosophical. Practical because regulations existed to maintain clear boundaries between Allied personnel and enemy prisoners. Philosophical because providing spiritual care suggested that these women deserved treatment reserved for Allied personnel and American civilians. Chaplain Washington's defense relied on fundamental pastoral responsibility that transcended military regulation: the obligation to provide spiritual care for all human souls, regardless of nationality or political affiliation. The recognition that denying religious consideration to certain people contradicted the Christian principles that American society claimed to represent. He argued that treating German prisoners as unworthy of spiritual care validated the same dehumanizing logic that Nazi ideology had used to justify its own atrocities. That true victory over fascism required demonstrating superior moral commitment to human dignity rather than simply imposing superior military force. The colonel's response revealed the institutional tension between military efficiency and moral principle, between following orders and exercising individual conscience, between treating defeated enemies as security threats requiring control versus treating them as human beings requiring redemption. Military training provided clear guidance about maintaining discipline and following regulations, but it offered less clarity about situations where regulations conflicted with fundamental moral obligations that military service was supposedly designed to protect. The compromise allowed continuation of informal religious conversations while prohibiting formal services or organized gatherings that might be interpreted as official recognition of prisoner rights to spiritual care. Chaplain Washington could speak with individual prisoners about religious questions, but he could not conduct group worship or establish regular schedule that implied systematic pastoral ministry. The distinction was bureaucratic rather than practical, but it allowed military authorities to maintain regulatory compliance while permitting activities that improved camp morale and reduced security concerns. The impact extended beyond immediate participants. Women who attended these conversations carried questions and insights back to prisoners who had not participated directly, creating ripple effects through camp social dynamics that influenced attitudes toward American personnel, toward post-war possibilities, toward personal responsibility for wartime actions. The recognition that enemy forces included individuals capable of treating German prisoners with dignity and respect challenged fundamental assumptions about Allied occupation, about American racial hierarchy, about the meaning of liberation versus conquest. Ingrid, a former youth leader from Stuttgart, described the experience years later as learning to see Americans as human beings rather than propaganda caricatures. For someone trained from adolescence to view Allied forces as cultural and racial enemies, discovering that American military included a black chaplain who spoke perfect German and showed genuine concern for German spiritual welfare required reconsidering basic assumptions about nationality, race, moral authority, the meaning of civilization versus barbarism. The conversations also provided opportunities for German women to process guilt about their participation in Nazi system, to explore responsibility for actions taken under political pressure, to consider possibilities for redemption that didn't require complete self-condemnation. Chaplain Washington's approach avoided both blanket forgiveness that ignored moral reality and blanket condemnation that denied possibility for change. Instead, focusing on individual accountability within larger systems that had made moral choice extremely difficult. The theological discussions revealed how Nazi ideology had distorted Christian teaching, how political requirements had subordinated religious conscience, how cultural nationalism had replaced spiritual commitment. Many women discovered that their understanding of German Christianity had been shaped more by political propaganda than by biblical instruction, that true religious tradition offered resources for critiquing rather than supporting racial hatred and militaristic nationalism. By spring 1946, the informal religious gatherings had become one of the most stable elements of camp life, providing psychological support for women processing trauma of defeat, while offering framework for reconstruction of identity based on recognition rather than denial of moral responsibility. The conversations didn't eliminate political differences or resolve complex questions about war guilt and post-war justice, but they created space for dialogue that acknowledged shared humanity across boundaries that institutional hatred had insisted were unbridgeable. The irony was profound and profoundly instructive. German women trained to despise Black Americans as racially inferior discovered spiritual guidance from a Black chaplain who treated them with dignity their own military had often denied them. American military personnel who enforced racial segregation within their own forces observed German prisoners receiving pastoral care from someone they would not allow to serve white American congregations in the South. The recognition challenged assumptions on all sides, forcing participants to reconsider basic beliefs about race, nationality, moral authority, the meaning of liberation and occupation. What emerged was evidence that respect transcends artificial boundaries, that human dignity persists despite systematic attempts to eliminate it, that individual choice can resist institutional policies designed to prevent recognition and understanding. Chaplain Washington's decision to provide spiritual care for German prisoners demonstrated that moral courage sometimes requires challenging regulations in order to honor fundamental principles that regulations are supposedly designed to protect. The women who participated carried these insights into post-war reconstruction, into relationships with American occupation forces, into their own process of rebuilding German society on foundations that acknowledged rather than denied moral responsibility for Nazi crimes. The recognition that individual Americans, especially Black Americans, had treated them with dignity and respect when their own system had failed them provided concrete evidence that democratic values could be more than propaganda. That human equality was possible even when institutional practice fell short of stated ideals. Years later, Brunhilde reflected on the experience. He convinced me that I was still worth saving, that God's love didn't depend on nationality or politics, that redemption was possible even for people who had supported evil systems. But more than that, he showed me what it meant to treat enemies with the dignity that makes peace possible. The winter afternoons of 1945 became something none of the participants had expected. Moments when humanity spoke louder than hatred, when individual conscience transcended institutional prejudice, when the simple act of speaking someone's language in their time of deepest need created bridges across boundaries that politics insisted were unbridgeable. In a world where systematic dehumanization had proven efficient at organizing mass violence, where official policies had successfully convinced millions that certain people deserved elimination rather than recognition, the quiet insistence That every human soul deserved spiritual care represented revolutionary resistance to the logic that made such policies possible. The black chaplain who spoke German to enemy prisoners understood something military regulations had missed: that treating defeated enemies with dignity was not weakness, but strength; that demonstrating moral superiority required more than military victory; that true liberation meant liberating both oppressor and oppressed from the hatred that made oppression possible. His decision to provide spiritual care across racial and national boundaries challenged everyone involved to reconsider basic assumptions about human worth, about redemption, about the possibility for understanding across differences that seemed unbridgeable. If this story reminds you that respect is a choice individuals make regardless of institutional policies, that human connection transcends the categories that politics attempts to maintain, then perhaps you understand why dignity travels across any distance, why speaking someone's language means more than vocabulary, why the most radical act of resistance sometimes looks like the simple recognition that every human soul deserves to be seen, truly seen, as worthy of care. In that frozen camp in Bavaria, between barbed wire and winter sky, where official policy demanded distance and unofficial humanity demanded connection, where institutional hatred met individual conscience, the eternal questions found temporary answers in the revolutionary act of treating enemies as human beings deserving spiritual consideration. And in that recognition, in that unexpected grace, in that moment when language became bridge rather than barrier, perhaps we glimpse what redemption looks like when it refuses to respect the boundaries that keep us from seeing each other as worthy of the dignity we all desperately need.